from here. The Kohen who does the Zrika, he's the one who gets to eat. The Kohen who doesn't do the Zrika, you don't get to eat. You don't get to eat. So I'll say, so again, the Gemara says, is that true? Is that true? Only the Kohen who does the Zrika ultimately goes ahead and gets to eat. Is that true? So the Gemara says, thank you. The Gemara says, Bahare. All right, good morning, Chevron Zoom. Sorry, we had some technical difficulties this morning. My apologies for the delay. We are at Tzaddik Test 99a, 4 lines down from the top. So the Gemara says as follows: Bahare mishamra kula de'in machti ba'ofen. But what about the fact that, again, I will say, you make it sound like that halacha l'maisa, it is only the Kohen who does the zrika that ultimately, again, is able to go ahead and eat. But that's not true. What about the fact that halacha l'maisa, there's an entire mishmar, right? Remember, again, the Kohanim are divided up into mishmoro. So divided up into, mishmar literally means watches, right? But it really means shifts. So remember, again, each shift is also comprised of multiple families. Each shift serves in the Beis HaMikdash 1 week a year. Any Kohanic family whose shift is on is able to go ahead and eat of karbanos. Now, obviously, there's only one Kohen who's going ahead and sprinkling, right? Only one Kohen. So again, the Gemara says, how can you say that it's only the Kohen who goes ahead and sprinkles, who is the one who's able to eat? The Gemara says, there's the entire mishmar. The entire mishmar of the kahuna who are not doing the zriga, yet they are still eating. To which the Gemara answers, Ra'ui lechitui ka'aminon. No, what you mean is like this. In order for a Kohen, I will say, here's the rule. In order for a Kohen to eat of karbanos, he has to have the capacity to do the zriga. In other words, he has to be able to. Here it is, we'll say, here's the rule. In order to go ahead and eat of karbanos, you must have the ability to do the zrika. You don't have to actually be doing the zrika, but you have to have the ability to do so. The Gemara says, 1 second. Hari katan de'ino roi lechitui va'ochel. What about a katan? Right, a katan, a child who obviously is not able to do zrika because he is a katan, and yet we know that a katan is permitted to go ahead and eat of the karbanos. Thank you. Perfect. Thank you so much. The Kohen is able to, so the Katan is able to go ahead and eat of the karbanos. Ela ma yochlena, rather says the Gemara, you're right. What does yochlena mean? Yachlekena. Yachlekena. Roi lechitui, cholik, shena roi lechitui, eno cholik. So the Gemara answers essentially, again, any Kohen that is in some way is fit to go ahead and do these zrika, ultimately, again, will be fit to receive a sacrificial portion. If you're not fit to do this zrika, then ultimately, again, you don't get a sacrificial portion. I will say now, again, what that means also is, lav dafka, you yourself have to be actually fit in this moment. What it really means is categorically fit. Categorically fit. So therefore, even a katan, let's say, again, would still be categorically fit, even though right now he's disqualified because of age. So the Gemara says, hari balmum. 1 second. We knew this was coming. What about balmum? Right, because we'll say again, remember again, balmum, because remember, the Gemara now says that the Mishnah is teaching me a rule. In order to partake, in order to eat of karbanos, you have to be a type of Kohen who is fit to do zrika. If you're not fit for zrika, then ultimately, again, you can't go ahead and get a sacrificial portion. What about the balmum? A Kohen who's a balmum ultimately, again, is not fit to eat. Yet, halacha l'maisa, again, he gets a portion, as we saw in the Mishnah, to which the Gemara says, no. Balmum rabbi rachmana. Balmum is different, right? Balmum is different. Why is balmum different? Because the Torah itself goes ahead and is merabehem. The riboy for balmum, what's the riboy? Kol zachar bekohanim l'rabos balmum. The pasuk says, when it says all male kohanim, that comes to include balmum in carbonic consumption. Ve'ema kol zachar l'rabos tvul yom. But how do you know that? Why don't you say kol zachar ultimately comes to, in other words, let's say kol zachar just means every male. You're telling me that every male comes to include balmum. Say that every male comes to include tvul yom. Right? Just do that. So the Gemara says, Mistabra bal mum havele l'rabuye shekein ochal. No. It makes more sense to say that it includes bal mum. Why? Because we already have precedent that a bal mum consumes karbanos. In other words, Rabbi say, you're right. As much as we know that a bal mum can't do avoda, a kohen who is a bal mum, we've already established, is permitted to eat karbanos. Therefore, it makes more sense that once we know that he has a license to eat karbanos, that he would be included in kol zachar, as opposed to Tibul Yom, who we know can't eat karbanos. Adrabah, I can say just the opposite. Tibul Yom havadei l'rabuye, de la arta michsa chazi. But I can say just the opposite. Tibul Yom, here's just also seriously in Tibul Yom and Bal Mum. Tibul Yom comes the night, he will be fit. Right? Tibul Yom comes the night, ultimately again, he will be fit to do the avodah. So Bal Mum will not. To which the Gemara says, Hashtamia halo chazi. You're right. Tibul Yom will become fit tonight, but right now, he's not fit. Right now, he's not fit, and therefore, again, he is excluded. So we'll say, so again, so just to pause here for just what the Gemara is teaching us is that halacha l'maisa, the Mishnah is teaching me a rule. The rule is, any kohen who is fit to do the avodah, ultimately, again, receives a sacrificial portion. You're not fit to do the avodah, you don't get a sacrificial portion. There is an exception to that rule. Who's the exception? Bal Mum. Why is he the exception? Because there's a ribuy of kol zachar. He's learned that from an addition in the pasuk, kol zachar. Says Rabbi Yossi says, Michti, let's analyze. My yochlena. So now what we're saying is also when the pasuk says yochlena, really what that means, it doesn't mean eat. Rather, what does it mean? Yachlekena. Right? It means ultimately, again, receive a portion. If that's the case, because also remember again, all of this is being learned now from the pasuk of hakohen hamechata osa yochlena. The kohen who does the zrika, he will eat. Now, obviously, we already understand that's not literal, because that makes it sound like only the kohen who eats only the kohen who does the zrika gets to eat. We know that that's not true. So rather, it means any kohen ultimately who is fit to do the zrika, yochlena means receives a portion. So now the Gemara Rabbi Yosef, Amar Michti, my yochlena yachlekena. Now that we've established that, what does yochlena mean? Yochlena means to divide it up. If that's the case, lichtov rachmana yachlekena. Why don't you just say it? Why don't you just say hakohen hamechata osa yachlekena? Right? Why not just say the kohen who does the zrika ultimately again will divide it up? So the Gemara says, "My yochlena." Why does it say yochlena? Shma mina roi laachila cholik. Rather, what do I learn from here? Ultimately, again, if a kohen is fit to eat, that doesn't sound right? In other words, right? If the kohen himself is able to consume, then ultimately, again, cholek, he receives a portion. She'ein roi la'achila, if he does not have the ability to eat, ein cholek, he does not receive a portion. So in other words, the Torah purposely goes ahead and phrases receiving a portion in the form of consumption to teach us, when do you receive a portion? If you are fit to consume. But if you're not fit, if you're not able to eat, then halacha l'maisa, you don't receive a portion. In other words, they're both saying, because I would have thought otherwise, even if I can't go ahead and eat it now, let me receive my portion now, I'll eat it tonight, like the Tibul Yom. Kamash Malan, if you can't consume, ultimately, again, you are not fit to receive a portion. Incredible. So I'll say, interesting case here. Barish Lakish, Balmum v'hu tameh. So watch this. What happens if the kohen is a Bal Mum and he's also Tameh? Mahu shiachleku lo. Does he receive a portion? Now, we'll say, now why is this an interesting case? Because remember again, a Bal Mum receives a portion. Right? Even though Bal Mum is the exception to the rule, that even though he can't do the avodah, halacha l'maisa, again, he still receives a portion. Tameh, person who's Tameh, kohen who's Tameh, does not receive a portion. What happens if a Bal Mum is Tameh? Can he still receive a portion? So the Gemara says, Kevan delo chazi, brachmana rabye. So since really, again, I will say, remember, according to our rule, a Bal Mum should not be fit to receive a sacrificial portion. But yet, the Torah is marba. There's a riboy, kol zachar b'kohanim. The Torah includes him to give him a portion. So once the Torah included him, do we say, Loshna, the Gemara says, Loshna, mali tameh, mali Bal Mum. Maybe who cares? In other words, once he's in the category of Bal Mum, he's already in. He's already in to receive a portion. So whether, again, he is Tameh, he's not Tameh, maybe that doesn't matter at all. Odama, or maybe not. Odama, Roi Lachi L'Cholek. Or no. What we say is like this, the rule still applies. If a kohen is fit to consume, then halacha l'maaseh gets a portion. If not, then he doesn't get a portion. A Baal Mum is fit. Someone who's tamei is not. Therefore, halacha l'maaseh, if you have a kohen who's a Baal Mum and tamei, he doesn't get a portion. So we'll say it's a good shayla. Amar Rabba says, Tashma, kohen gadol makriv onein. A kohen gadol is able to offer a karban even in a state of aninos. Now, let's talk about this just a moment because we're going to get into aninos in a little bit. And actually, very interesting sugya. If you look at Rashi, makriv onein. If you move your finger to the right, move to the right in Rashi, about 5 lines up. Makriv onein. Listen to this. Dichsev bei la'avivu li'imo lo yitama. Umina mikdash lo yetze. So remember again, by Kohen Gadol does not become tamei for anyone, right? Even his 7 close relatives, mother, father, brother, sister, son, daughter, spouse, right? He does not become tamei. And the Torah explicitly says, not only does he not become tamei, umina mikdash lo yetze. He does not leave the confines of the Beis HaMikdash. So Rashi says over here, Ino tzarech lotzeis min HaMikdash, Biyomisas Aviv V'imo. He does not leave the Beis HaMikdash on the day of the death of his father and mother. Shavadasa ino mechalales ha'achar hedyot shelo yotzachila. The Torah goes out of its way to say that he doesn't leave the Mikdash. What does it mean if he doesn't leave the Mikdash? It means what? He does the avoda. What does that show? That for a Kohen Gadol, if he does the avoda in a state of aninos, the avoda is not profaned. But we learn by extension that if another Kohen does do the avoda in a state of aninos, the avoda is absolutely compromised. Now, let's go back to the Gemara. So Tashma, Kohen Gadol makrivoni, ve'eno ochel, ve'eno cholik le'echol be'erev. Ooh, now this is very interesting. You're right. A Kohen Gadol could do the avoda even in a state of aninos. However, he is not permitted to eat of karbanos in his state of aninos. Not only that, he can't receive a portion on the day of his aninos to eat that night. So interestingly enough, what do you see from here? That the Kohen Gadol has a permit to work, but ultimately not to receive a sacrificial portion. Shema mina ro'i la'achila. So what do you see from here? In order to go ahead and receive a sacrificial portion, you have to be able to consume it. If you're not able to consume it, you don't get it. Who's the raya for that? The raya for that is Kohen Gadol. Kohen Gadol is incredibly unique because he could even do the avoda in a state of aninos, but he's not allowed to eat karbanos in a state of aninos. Because he's not allowed to eat karbanos, therefore what? He doesn't get a portion. Meaning, I would have said, give him a portion and he'll eat it tonight, because tonight he's out of aninos. We'll talk about that in just a moment. He's out of aninos. Kamash malon, that since he can't eat it on the day of aninos, he can't get a portion. So what do you see from here? If you can't eat, you don't get a portion. Therefore, this resolves our query. This resolves our question. What was our question? A kohen who's a Baal Mum and Tamei, does he get a portion? And the answer is no. Why? Because since he is Tamei, he is not allowed to eat al tzistuma. Al tzistuma, even though as a Baal Mum he could, but al tzistuma he can't eat, and because he can't eat, he does not get a portion. Incredible. Incredible. Both sides. This is very important. In order to get a portion, you have to be able to consume it. And if you can't consume it, you don't get it. Next. Bar Rav Oshia. So we'll say this is very interesting. What if a kohen is tamei and he's by communal offerings? I will say, and remember again, right? Communal offerings 101. What's the halacha about anything with the tzibor? Tuma hutra b'tzibor. Which means that technically speaking, a kohen who is tamei could do a carbon tzibor. Not only that, I will say, in other words, I just want to point out, even in a case where, let's say, the rov of the tzibor is not tamei, if a kohen tamei did a carbon tzibor, ex post facto, it's kosher. It's pretty dramatic. Take a look at Rashi just a moment. Ma'ushiach lekanalo mi carbon tzibor lechol la'erev uba carbon tzibor shek rivu tahorim kami ba'ilei I palgi mine lahai tamei hoel v'roi lechitui the carbon tzibor dochet tuma. So listen, I watch this. So can a kohen who is tamei receive a portion of a carbon tzibor in order to eat it that night? Since technically speaking, if he were to offer up the carbon tzibor, it technically would be kosher. Would be kosher. So the Gemara says, what's halacha? Do we see on one hand, a kohen receives a portion if he could do the zrika, if he could do the avoda. And this kohen, technically speaking, could do the avoda, because technically, a kohen who is tamei could do the avodah of a carbon. Oh, dealing with the other possibility is Ra'i la'achila cholek, shein ra'i la'achila eina cholek. Where the other possibility is like this: only a kohen who is fit to consume ultimately again receives a portion. If he's not able to eat, then he doesn't get a portion. And right now, this kohen who is tamei can't eat. Gemara says as follows: Amar Ravina, suppose I same idea. Tashma kohen gadol makrivon. Close the same case. A kohen gadol is able to offer up the karban in a state of aninos ve'ino ochel. But he is not allowed to eat, and therefore, because he's not allowed to eat, ve'eno cholek, he does not receive a portion, even to eat it that evening. La'achal ba'erev, shmamina ra'i la'achila ba'inan shmamina. Suppose say, what do you see from here? We're reinforcing the same point. In order to receive a carbonic portion, you have to be fit to eat it now. If you can't eat it now, you don't get a portion even to consume it later. So essentially what we see is there's really two parts to the rule. What kind of kohen gets a portion ultimately again in karbanos? Number one, a kohen who is fit to do avoda, and number two, a kohen who is capable of eating karbanos now. If you're capable of eating it now, then halacha l'maaseh again, you can get a portion. If you're not capable of eating it now, you don't get a portion. Once again, what's swirling in the back of our head is the exception to this rule, which is Baal Mum. Again, which we'll circle back to. Let's go weiter. So we'll say now we're going to talk a little bit more about aninos. Onin nogea ve'ino makrivs. Remember again, an onin is able to go ahead and touch a carbon, which is an interesting statement. It was like poking it, So we'll discuss that. That's right. So onin nogea ve'ino makriv, right? So onin could go ahead and touch a carbon, but ultimately he cannot offer it. Says the Gemara. Again, obviously, we'll say once again, it's just about a regular kohen. The exception, as we've seen already, reinforced twice, is the kohen gadol. So the Gemara says, onin nogea. Is that true that an onin is allowed to touch a carbon? Or many Marzikasha, Onein u'Mechusar Kippurim, right? Onein and Mechusar Kippurim. Remember again, Mechusar Kippurim is anyone who's gone through the requisite passage of time for Tara, has even gone to the mikvah, has even had hair of Shemesh, but still has to bring certain accompanying karbanos. Swas halacha, tzrichin tvila l'kodesh. These individuals ultimately, again, need to go to the mikvah before coming into the Kodesh, before touching Kodesh. So what do you see from here? You see from here that an onein needs immersion. If an onein needs immersion, so how are you able to say that he's able just to touch karbanos in a state of aninos? Not a problem. Our Mishnah, when it says that an onein could touch karbanos, what is it talking about? He went to the mikvah. Okay, that's what it means. If he went to the mikvah already, then he could go and touch karbanos. But Allah, again, I just want to point out, when we speak about this idea about an onein going to the mikvah, this is not because the onein was with the dead relative. Obviously, if it was with the dead relative, then that's para aduma, right? That's a totally separate halacha. This seems to be a separate din, that onein has to go to the mikvah before coming back into the kodesh. So the Gemara says, no problem. Our Mishnah that said that halacha l'maisa on onein could touch karbanos is when he went to the mikvah. The Brisa that says that he can't is talking about the where he didn't go to the mikvah. The chitava maihavi. I don't understand. Even if he went to the mikvah, who cares? Ha-hadr ale aninos. The status of aninos ultimately again reverts back. Now again on both sides. So remember, when we speak about aninos, what the Gemara is referring to over here is the actual day of death. Right? Reuven is a Kohen, lost his father on Monday. That entire day, he is in halachic aninos, which means that even if he goes to the mikvah on Monday, the status of aninos reverts. So what exactly does he accomplish? Even if an onein went to the mikvah on the day of his aninos, aninuso choseres alav. The aninos ultimately again devolves upon him again. Lokash, the Gemara says, it's not a contradiction. This is very interesting. One case is talking about, again, where he had a lapse of awareness, and one is where he had focused awareness. So what does this mean? The Gemara says, Rashi says over here, it's this last short line, Mishmiras gufo, so we'll say, now listen to this. One case is talking about where the onain had ongoing concentration, namely that, again, I have to be careful to maintain my state of personal purity. The other case, that's the case ultimately, again, where he's able to go ahead and touch Kadshim, versus a case where at Hesech Hadas, he just wasn't really thinking about, again, the levels, right, just maintaining his personal Kedusha. In that case, he can't touch Kadshim. Someone says, 1 second, Hesech Hadas, if he has a lapse of awareness about his personal state of purity, Shlishi Ushvi boy, then he requires, then we'll say that is a concern of Tumas Meis. If there's a concern of Tumas Meis, that's Paraduma. Paraduma requires sprinkling on days 3 and 7. The Amar Rav Yustoi, interesting name. Then Rabbi Yustoi, Rabbi Masan, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Hesech Hadas, Sarech Hazah, Shlishi Ushvi. Again, we'll say this is a general rule, right? A Kohen must be ever mindful of his state of personal purity. And the moment that there's a lapse about that, ultimately, again, he's going to require, really, we have to assume almost like there's Tumas Meis, and he's going to require a sprinkling of the waters of the Paraduma on day 3 and day 7. Lo Kashya, Hada Asik Mitame Meis, Hada Asik Mitumas Sheretz. It's very interesting. Now, the Kohen was careful to go ahead and be mindful about coming in contact with a corpse. What wasn't he mindful of? Tumas Sheretz. Tumas Sheretz. Okay, the Gemara says, 1 second, I understand. Tamei Sheretz, Tamei Ma'al. I understand. Tumas Sheretz is still a bona fide form of Tumah. Herev Shemesh boy. Okay, granted, it doesn't require sprinkling days 3 and day 7, but it still is going to require Herev Shemesh. V'od, furthermore, Afilu Truma Nami. If that's the case, that there's Hesech Hadas for Tumas Sheretz, then Halacha L'maisa, the Kohen should require a mikvah even before eating Truma. So what's the case? So remember, we're just trying to figure out, we have a contradiction, right? Because our Mishnah says that an onain is able to touch Kadshim. The Brisa says that the onain needs to go to the mikvah before touching Kadshim. So we're just trying to reconcile these cases. So what's the case? This is very interesting. Ba'omer, nishmarti midavra hamitamani, v'lo nishmarti midavra haposlani. So this is very interesting. What's the case? The case where the Kohen says, I have been vigilant to go ahead and guard myself, keep myself from coming in contact from anything that would make me tamei, but not from anything that would make me pasul. Again, so we've seen this terminology before. Tamei refers to tuma daraisa. Pasul means to tuma dirabanan. So the Kohen essentially says, I've been makbid on biblical tumah, but I've not been careful with anything that might be rabbinic tumah. Okay, so that's very interesting. Is there such a thing like that? Where a person says, I've been careful for this kind of tumah, but not for this kind of tumah? Like, does that actually exist? Which the Gemara says, actually it does. V'atanya, I will say, by the way, it's also such an interesting metaphor about a person saying I'm makbid on these types of tumah, but not makbid on these types of tumah. So the Gemara says, does that really happen? You're like, yeah, we do that all the time, right? It's like, most of my life is like that, right? I'm careful. This thing I'm not going to do, but this thing I'm definitely going to do. So the Gemara says, yeah, people do that all the time. That time, you listen to this. Odeo hasal al rosho. So this is an interesting case over here. Person is carrying a basket on their head. Now, the case over here is a basket of figs. Zal rosho, on the base, umagrifa bisoko, and a magrifa. And I will say, magrifa literally means like a shovel, but in this case, it's not really a shovel. What it is Rashi points out over here, it's a metal utensil that has like a sharp head. What you would do is you would use this kind of almost like a cake knife. You would use it to cut apart the figs. In a cake of pressed figs, you will use it to cut the figs from one another. Okay, magrifa b'socho. So listen to this. And what happened? Reuven carrying this basket of figs on his head. It's a 99b, first line. V'amar libi ala sal ve'in libi ala magrefa. And Reuven says, I've been focusing on the basket. I haven't been focused on the magrefa. Shovel's the wrong word, but that's magrefa. What is it? A pick. Shovel. It says shovel, right? It says, because that's how it normally, okay, whatever. The kli. Right? So Reuven says, literally, I've been careful to guard the basket from tumah, but I've not been vigilant. I haven't been mindful regarding the utensil. So what happens in a case like that? So the Gemara says, hasal tahar va'magrefa tmeya. So what's the halacha? The halacha is ultimately, again, the basket is tahar, and the kli is tameh. What do you see from here, Abosai? You see from here that halacha l'maisa, there is a concept of ultimately being mindful or being vigilant about one thing, but not about something else. So therefore, if a Kohen goes in and says, I have been careful to guard myself from biblical tumah, but I've not necessarily been vigilant regarding rabbinic tumah, right? Or what we call tumah versus pasal. The Gemara says, yeah, there's actually such a thing like that. The Gemara says, by the way, just back to the fig case, the Gemara says, at the time of Magrefa Lasal, I don't understand why wouldn't the Magrefa, why wouldn't the Kli automatically convey tumah to the basket? To which the Gemara says, because ein kli metame kli, because one utensil can't be metame another utensil. But why wouldn't the kli be metame the figs? Amarava was the case. Ba'omer shmartia midavar hametama v'lo shmartia midavar haposla, because where he says ultimately again, I was careful to guard it against something that would convey to it tumah, but not careful to go ahead and guard it from something that would passel it. So in other words, at most, the shovel became exposed to rabbinic tumah, and rabbinic tumah would not allow for conveyance of tumah. Okay, Rabbi say, bottom line for us is what we begin to see is this concept, ultimately again, of being vigilant about certain forms of tumah and not other forms of tumah. To which the Gemara says, "Galgala milsa umati lekami Rabbi Abba bar Mamo." The Gemara says this matter, right? This whole thing kind of was kicked up ladder. Because remember again, what's our discussion over here? Our whole discussion over here is about onein, right? Because the Mishnah said that an onein can touch kachim, can touch karbanos. The Brisa said an onein can't touch karbanos. So we're just trying to reconcile this. The Gemara says, "Igalgal milsa," the matter kind of escalated. Igalgal milsa umati lekamid Rabbi Abba bar Mamo. The Kimber Rabbi Abba bar Mamo. Amrlei lo shmir lahu hadam Rabbi Yochanan Amarav. Didn't you hear what Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rav? Ha'ochel shlishi shel truma aser lechol umutar liga. So this is very interesting. If somebody eats truma, that is a shlishi, right? A third tier of tumah. Because remember again, tumah can be conveyed. Every time it's conveyed, every time it's transferred, it goes down a notch. Someone eats truma, which is a shlishi. What's the halacha? Asr lechol. He's not permitted to eat another form of truma, umutar liga, but he is permitted to touch it. Alma, what do you see from here? Ba'achila avod rabbanan ma'ila, benegia lo avod rabbanan ma'ila. We'll say what we begin to see something very important, which is when it comes to achila, the rabbanan made certain safeguards and said that if you pretty much have any form of tumah, you can't eat kachim. However, when it came to physical contact, there the rabbis did not make additional safeguards, and therefore halacha l'maisa, when our Mishnah says that an onein is permitted to go ahead and touch truma, or touch kachim, I should say, that's because, again, the Rabbanan said onin can't eat it, halacha l'maisa. But, and again, he can't eat it, this is all circular. He can't eat it, why? Because remember, again, he can't serve, right? He can't do avoda. Because he can't do avoda, therefore he can't eat. Because he can't eat, he doesn't get a portion. But when it comes to physical contact, that the Rabbanan were not goes there. Okay, incredible. Ve'eno cholik le'achol. Now, it's very interesting. Furthermore, so remember, an onein, still an aninos. An onein does not get a portion. He doesn't get a portion. So the Gemara says something very interesting. Mitlag hu de lo palig v'chim zamni le'achel. So Rabbi said, this is how fascinating this is. What could I infer from here? I could infer that an onein does not get a portion. But if his friends invited him to join them that night, he would be permitted to do so, right? He doesn't get a portion, but again, if his other Kohanic friends are eating together that night, ultimately, again, he would be able to eat with them. So Gemara says, is that true or minu? Or mini, onein, tovel va'ochel, as pischol erev, avalok b'kachim. Yet Rabbi look at the following halacha. An onein, Rabbi imagine for a moment, Ruvain, who's a Kohen, was an onein on Erev Pesach. Erev Pesach. So the Gemara says now, an onein could go to the mikvah, because we've already established again that an onein does have to immerse before partaking of sacrificial items. Va'ochel as pischol erev, and he can eat his karban Pesach that night. Now, what do we infer from that? He can eat his karban Pesach aval lo b'kachim, but he can't go ahead and eat kachim. He can't eat kachim. Now there's a lot unfolding over here. Let's take a quick look at Rashi. Va'ocha pischo la'erev. You see that Rashi? Almost right across in Rashi. Avalo b'kachim. So again, so I just want to point out how fascinating this is. So remember again, this is Ruvain. Ruvain is a Kohen. He's an Onain. Right? Zara Pesach, he's an Onain. So now the Gemara says he could eat his carbon Pesach that night, but he can't eat other sacrifices that night. Look at Rashi. He says, Ochal Pischo la'erev, avalo b'kachim, mefarshei b'psachim, kasavar, aninos laila d'rabanon, va'aninos d'oraisa chad yomohu, ki dichsiv v'acharisa ki yomar. The Gabe Pesach, I'm just going to read it. Gabe Pesach lo emidu divrei makom kares. Gabe kachim hemidu divrei makom aseh. The achilas kash kamir. We're supposed to listen to this. Let me just say this outside, and then we'll listen to this. Aninos daraisa is the day of death. Okay. Now, midrabanan, we're going to see. Let's make the assumption right now. Midrabanan, the Rabbanan extended aninos into the following night, assuming that burial has not yet occurred. So let's say again. Let's say Monday is today. Monday is Erev Pesach. Ruvain loses his father. Ruvain is in biblical Aninos day of. Let's say for some reason the burial is not happening until sometime later on. The rabbis extended the status of Aninos into the night. So Aninos Laila is D'Rabbanan. Therefore, that night, Ruvain still can't go ahead and eat karbanos. But Chazal did not establish their halacha when it comes to Karban Pesach. Since failure to eat Karban Pesach is a chiyuv kares, therefore, Chazal relaxed their aninos that night to allow them to eat Karban Pesach, but not other karbanos. That's what it means when it says over here, Onein, Tovo v'ochel es pischo la'erev, avalo b'kachim. So that night, the Onein could go ahead and eat his Karban Pesach, but he can't eat other karbanos. To which the Gemara says, so we'll say, no, we'll stop over here for today. We'll pick, let me just read more line. So the Gemara says, no, we'll stop. I'm Rabbi Yomi Difti, lo kasha, kan b'Pesach, kan b'shari mos hashana. B'Pesach, I did the achal Pesach, achal nami kachim, b'shari mos hashana, lo chazi. So I'm going to suggest as follows. It could very well be that maybe the night of Pesach is a little bit different. Why? Because we'll say maybe by the night of Pesach, once there's permission to eat Karban Pesach, there's also what? Permission to eat other forms of karbanos as well, right? But halacha l'maisa on other nights where there's no permit for Karban Pesach, ultimately again there's no permission for other karbanos as well. So therefore, this is what the Gemara wants to suggest. So again, right now we're making the following assumption that aninos laila, aninos that follows the right, aninos at night that follows the day of aninos is d'Rabbanan. On Karban Pesach, Chazal relaxed their aninos to light the Karban Pesach. The Gemara is suggesting once you can eat Karban Pesach, you can also eat other karbanos as well. But on any other night, there's no permit to consume any type of kachim. We'll stop over here for today. We'll pick up with this concept in your session. Shkoyach. Moshe, can I give you the audio?
I know it's the only thing, but maybe it's my mind today. Tomorrow morning.